Hello everyone, this is Menz here. I'm going to be breaking down the new Tier 9 Russian heavy tank, the Object 257's armor here in this weak spot guide. Now, this is the tank that replaces the T10. It has much more armor than it in the grand scheme of things, especially when it comes to side armor, and it has a pretty unique armor scheme, so it's going to be really tricky to deal with this if you don't know what you're doing, especially when you're faced with the side of this thing. Starting out frontally here, let me pull up kind of my overlay for this, which I do have a written guide for the Object 257's armor as well. You can find a link in the video description. Also at the end of the video, it'll pop up a link as well. But looking at the armor here, just head on here, I kind of picked the most important areas to kind of go over. So starting at the lower glacis here, 198 millimeters effective armor. So when you're shooting it with AP, APCR, that's actually a little bit weaker than that given normalization. But for most tanks, the lower plate will be a weak spot to kind of, have at it for the Object 257. So unless you're, say like in a tier 7 or a very low penning tier 8, you might have some difficulties with it, but more or less, lower plate head-on is the easiest weak spot to hit on the front for the Object 257. Now, one thing of note, you can't see it specifically in this view, but sometimes if you're in like a short tank, you can see kind of a little bar just coming across here. You can kind of see it here on the track. That's not part of the hole. If you're shooting up at it, that's part of the track, so try not to hit that. Moving on to the upper plate though. The upper glacis, it's 130 millimeters thick, much like the lower glacis, but it's angled at 57 degrees vertically and then an extra 34 degrees horizontally. So that gives it a minimum 283 millimeters effective armor. So that'll bounce quite a few shots thrown at it. Heat rounds, have a good chance to pen it given the tank that you're in. And more or less, if you're looking at it head on here, if you do have to hit the upper plate for some reason, you want to try to hit it, as close to the center and, basically center mass. As you kind of aim more towards the sides, your gun's actually adding a little bit more angle to it, so you will have a higher chance to bounce off. Now, just above the upper glacis here sits in the center. There's a driver viewport. You don't want to hit that, but if you do hit that area, it's only 45 millimeters thick. So if you have a large caliber gun, say like 155 millimeters, something like that, or larger, you can overmatch that area. Granted, guns like that, more or less, you're going to be able to punch through the upper glacis because, tier 10 TD, stuff like that. Now, moving on to the rest of the frontal armor here. I didn't label it in the little cutouts I have here, but there is like a very small part of the turret ring you can pen. Not center, that's 350 plus millimeters effective armor, just a little bit off to the side, but it's really hard to hit, which is why I didn't note it. Right around the gun, you can consider this a weak spot. It's about 250 millimeters thick, but it's literally just a little sliver around the gun, so it's really hard to hit. Some people are going to say that, the mantlet does have a hole, basically to the right of the gun if you're looking at it. However, it is pretty tough, 283 to 293 millimeters effective. So unless you're spamming gold at it, or, in a tier 10 TD shooting gold as well, or, even standard rounds, it's like 50-50 chance to pen it. It's not actually a weak spot, which is why I kind of put it in quotes. The rest of the turret though, like even going a little bit outside the mantlet here on the edges, that's still pretty darn thick to where it's over 283 millimeters effective. Not really worth shooting it. It's got a really tough turret on the front, given that a lot of it, is over 300 millimeters thick in the unangled bits. Now, right above the mantlet here, I will kind of zoom in after I go over this. There is an overmatch area on the roof. It's harder, to hit than it seems because, unless you're kind of long range or you're taller than the Object 257, it's not very visible. But if you do hit, in between the mantlet and the cupolas, it's only 30 millimeters thick. So even though it is at a ricochet angle, even for heat, most guns, that face the Object 257, have over 90 millimeter you know, a caliber on them, so they are able to overmatch, you know, even if you have 90 millimeter, you know. But actually hitting that, it is pretty difficult. You know, it is very small. It's not like a gigantic roof area, so I don't know how useful that'll be, given that, you know, hitting the cupolas, they are tiny, but you know, they are weak. 158 to 168 millimeters in the center of them. If you get towards the edges, unless you hit the very like side edge of it, that goes up to about 274 millimeters effective, with a little spot underneath it at 275. So most tanks will be able to deal with that, you know, not the cupola edges and beneath the cupola, since that's a little stronger, but the cupolas are able to be penned. So let me pull this down and just kind of point out these few little areas zoomed in closer. So some people will mention if you do need to pen the mantlet, it's right in this area, to where more or less penetrating that, it's not that weak compared to, say, the lower plate, even the upper glacis at times, or hitting the cupola area. This is the 30 millimeter roof area, which, you know, when you look at the Object 257 kind of head on, it is still visible, but actually hitting that and not hitting the mantlet, or potentially just missing altogether, it is difficult. But that is 30 millimeters thick, basically this little square area here. But the cupolas themselves, you know, basically aim center mass. That's the weakest armor on the front of the Object 257. Or if you kind of hit these little bulges, basically just, you know, stay in this area. Don't go too far towards the edges. So frontally, very good as far as the armor goes on this tank. Moving on to the side, I gotta get this lined up here the best I can. I tried to, it's cut out a little bit on the side, like my upper left kind of index there, because I tried to zoom in so it's a little bit easier to see the side armor on this thing, because it is pretty complex. So before I get into it, basically the upper glacis on the Object 257, it's kind of normal to where it angles, you know, kind of out from the top of the bottom of the turret. It angles like out away from the center of the tank. However, basically once you hit the side space armor, which I kind of have it outlined in teal, just beneath where the middle hole area starts. I'm getting a little confused there. This is difficult to explain this. It basically angles back into the center of the tank. If you remember what the frontal glacis looks like, which let me just show it so it's a little bit easier to understand. It's a diamond shape. So basically the side armor, you know, from here all the way down there just angles straight back into the tank. It's not like, you know, a flat bottom. It's different than most tanks, and this is, you know, it's the most confusing part of the tank, is understanding the side armor. Whereas the frontal armor, you know, shoot the lower plate, shoot the hatches. This, it's a little bit different. So let's pull the side armor back up here and get this kind of lined up the best I can. I'm going to start bottom to top. I didn't really do too much on the turret. I outlined and basically colored stuff in to where, you know, the cupola and basically hitting flat areas on the turret side is going to be your best chance to pen. But for lower tiers outside of the cupola, it is pretty tough to penetrate the side turret, given that it is very thick, you know, 240 millimeters across a lot of it. But starting at the bottom hull, so there's a small little bit that the top of the track's covered. I outlined it in red because pretty much even if you penetrate the tracks, given that they're only 20 millimeters thick, you're going to ricochet off because you're aiming down. This lower side hull, so starting down here, it's only 65 millimeters thick. However, it's angled at 68 degrees. So even though it's 178 millimeters effective, there's a very high chance you're going to ricochet off of it, because most tanks you're going to be shooting down at it, unless say you're in a really tiny light tank or like a Russian medium, and you're right next to this thing shooting at it and you're not aiming down at all. Or if, you know, you're beneath the tank on a hill and you're shooting up at it. Those chances you'll be able to actually penetrate it. And these, I'm specifically talking about the teal areas I kind of have outlined on this tank. So you're not going to want to hit the tracks, because that makes it a lot harder to actually pen, and most times you're shooting down, so it ricochets. So in between the tracks and the spaced armor, you're most likely going to ricochet because you're shooting down. If you have heat, you do have a chance to pen it, given that heat does not ricochet at the same angle as APCR. So you have a better chance to pen with heat. However, you are shooting between tracks and spaced armor here. So it is very difficult to actually pen the side here on the lower hull. Moving to the lower side hull with the space armor, which is the teal area, kind of the top area, you're hitting a 30 millimeter piece of space armor, which looks flat, but behind that, same 65 millimeter at 68 degrees armor. So the chances of you actually penetrating that, it's 204 millimeters effective. Heat won't pen there, given the space armor. And then when you factor in, the angle that you're shooting at, if you're shooting, say down an extra 3 degrees, which a lot of tanks, the Object 257 isn't the tallest tank. If you're shooting down, a couple extra degrees, you're going to ricochet off of it. So it's something to keep in mind, to where it's very tricky to actually pen this thing on the lower side hull. Now, before I go, higher up here, there is a small, I called it the front side hull weak spot, but put it in quotes because it's a very small piece to where the space armor kind of runs out in this red area where my mouse is. However, right basically between the track wheel and the upper hole that kind of bleeds through to the side here, there's a very small strip here. It's very tiny, to where this is 130 millimeters thick instead of the 65 you find right below it outlined in teal. However, it's not an auto bounce level, so it's 239 millimeters effective, excuse me. So you can actually penetrate it with, say, tier 9s, tier 10s, or, throwing premium rounds out of tier 8s and stuff. But, tier 7s will definitely struggle penning this thing here. But it is actually a weak spot, to where I've seen a few people making videos and, playing against this thing where, when they see this tank, I'm just going to change the view here a little bit. They're trying to track it, shooting it in the side hull, and that doesn't work because, as you can kind of see, when this thing's coming around, if you're trying to hit it here, you might be missing the hull completely, and you're not even hitting the hull armor behind it, to where, even say it's angling at this and you're shooting here, you're still hitting that armor that was angled at 68 degrees. And you're actually adding extra angle to that, since it's angling and it's not completely at a flat angle to you. So shooting it in this situation, you're not going to be able to penetrate the front glacis on the lower glacis. You're going to either want to penetrate this area or just barely beneath it, right above the track. You don't want to actually shoot the track area. So it sucks that you can't track that thing in this situation, but this thing does have a pretty unique side armor scheme. Getting to the spot where you should shoot the side hull, though, finally, the upper side hull here, it's 140 millimeters thick, 50 degrees angled. So it is still strong, 218 millimeters effective armor, to where, honestly, this thing, the Object 257, if I'm not mistaken, it was initially kind of planned to be released as a tier 10 tank, because the side armor on this thing, if you're thinking about this, going back to the front hull, to where the lower plate was 198 millimeters effective, and you still had the commander's cupola on the top, those weak spots, and a couple overmatch areas. This thing turned on its side, or even side scraping, tier 7s are basically not going to be able to touch this thing unless you can overmatch it, HE it, or you have a high pen heat round. And the thing, basically the side armor is pretty crazy, given that the lower hull was angled almost at an auto bounce level into the center of the tank. Getting onto the side turret, though, like I said a little earlier, basically it's very thick, so if you're in a tier 7, tier 8, you're going to bounce off of this a lot. A lot of the areas are above 240 millimeters effective, So keep in mind, you're still probably going to bounce if you're shooting like a standard round at this thing on the side, unless you're hitting it at the cupola, or basically try to hit it flat towards the center here. These areas are slightly tougher. They go above like 250, 260 millimeters effective, and kind of the same with the back here, to where this thing, it has pretty crazy armor. You know, it is kind of balanced in other means, but the armor is a little bit overboard here in my opinion. But you know, that's for another video. This is mainly for a weak spot guide. Finally, getting to the rear of this tank. Let me just line this up really quick here. You finally have some green areas where you can penetrate the thing. You know, most of the back, you know, it sits around 100 millimeters effective down to 81 millimeters effective on the lower plate here. Of, you know, something to keep in mind, basically this area, the little triangles cut out here on the tank, if I can toggle this real quick. So the triangles you see on the bottom left and right of that lower glacis, they're actually part of the suspension. They do not count as the hull of the tank, which, you know, love it or hate it, that's how Wargaming modeled this thing. To where, you know, basically it's not going to count as HP damage, but you will potentially track the thing. But basically just, you know, shoot the upper, lower plate, and also the rear turret in the center. Other than that, like only a few small bits around the edges of the turret and the side hull are actually pretty tough. But the rest of it is very weak. So in the grand scheme of things, you know, the Object 257, it's got pretty crazy armor. If, you know, you encounter it, you know, if you encounter it head on here, you're going to be able to hit it in the lower plate and be able to penetrate it pretty well. Against tier 9s and 10s, you know, they even have a chance to pen on that upper plate like I mentioned. But the thing that kind of makes this tank kind of broken when you're looking at its armor comes with the side, given that it's so heavily angled into the center of the tank and it doesn't flatten out any. So a lot of times you're going to see people say side scraping in this thing, and you're not going to be able to penetrate this side area. Can't really penetrate it in the spaced armor. The side armor here becomes auto bounce. The turret's really tough to pen. Where you're really kind of left with, you can penetrate it once it does angle. Since the upper plate is only 130 millimeters thick, you can pen it here fairly well when you're in a high penning tier 8, when you're in a tier 9 or a 10. They'll be able to pen this. You can still even penetrate the lower plate as well. However, facing this thing at a tier 7, you're going to have no chance in this thing. You're better off chucking HE, running away, something. Because, you know, this thing, even just heavily armor, angling even more with its armor, you know, you're not going to be able to penetrate the side, the armor, given that the side armor a little bit stronger in its weakest area than the front, and people are going to be trying to shoot it in the lower hole when you shouldn't be shooting it there, and it's just going to confuse a lot of people. Honestly, you know, one way to make this balanced, not to go off topic, is if they did kind of model this little area here, which is part of this suspension. You can kind of see it sticking out of the lower plate. That's modeled as the suspension. Honestly, if they had modeled that part of the hull, it's only 30 millimeters thick, you know, 20, 30, whatever they have it as, because the tracks are 20 millimeters, but it counts as the suspension. For some reason, to where you can see it more clearly on the back with this area that counts as the suspension. It would make a pretty glaring weak spot for this tank, but in its current state at tier 9, you know, the main problem with it, like, the armor is great and people can side scrape in it very well. You know, against tier 9s and 10s, the armor is great. However, it does have enough little drawbacks to where, you know, since, you know, the gun and other areas might not be too well, it does stand up pretty well against those. But the problem is at tier 9, against 7s and 8s, you're not going to have too much of a chance against this thing. But anyway, thank you very much, you know, for watching this weak spot guide. I was about to say tank guide for the Object 257. Hopefully it helped you out a little bit with learning where to penetrate this thing, when to run away screaming. Whether or not you agree, you know, how Wargaming's implementing this, you know, let me know in the comments how you feel about the armor for this tank. Again, it's going to pop up right after it kind of switches to my outro here. There's a link to the written guide for the weak spot guide for the Object 257 if you want to learn a little bit more. Otherwise, thanks again for watching. Have a very nice day. See ya.